This week, taking stock of Netflix and the Hollywood blowback its size is creating.
Then to Verizon, its video effort has no blowback. In fact, there's barely a gentle breeze.
And we'll pause for a moment to remember Mode Media, which let out its last breath this week.
And finally, the story of a Czech man who earned hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties because he captured Hillary Clinton's wobbly escape from the 9/11 ceremony on his cell phone. Is that too high a price?
Wobbly or not, we've got that and more on this week's edition of Hacking TV. I'm Steve Rosenbaum.
And I'm Saul Hansell, and we may wobble, but we won't fall down.
Yeah, well, and she didn't fall down either, just to be fair. But we'll get to the Hillary tape later in the show. Let's just start with Netflix right up top, because the Emmys have taken place, and clearly there were some surprises. We won't say what they were because we have secret information we don't want to reveal before the taping, but there were surprises.
I'm surprised already, but I always am. And probably no surprise is a whole bunch of reports coming from Hollywood this week looking, that collectively paint a picture of how huge, to use a political word, a success Netflix is. We know that, but the scope may be worth taking stock of, and then all of the reaction that Hollywood is having because of that, right? So one number that, just to blow you away, 4 years ago, Netflix had 4 original series. This year, they have 126. They're spending $6 billion on content.
And I can tell you, here's a secret, just for our listeners, just for our viewers,
yes.
No one knows this. They've cloned Ted Sarandos. There are at least 14 of him now. They spread them around the globe. There's a Sarandos in Europe. There's a Sarandos it's extraordinary to see him be multiple places at the same time. And
each of them has a big stack of checks.
Yeah, exactly right. Each of them has a wallet, a big fat wallet.
But then there's a bunch of numbers coming out of RBC Capital comparing Netflix to the broadcast networks, which is sort of not a fair comparison in some sense because, the broadcast networks make most of their money on advertising. Netflix makes no money on advertising. But the thing they have in common is money. And so if you look at how much money the networks make per minute that their audience, per person watching minute, Netflix is now making 5 cents in the U.S. for every minute that a person is watching it. That is the same as NBC and ABC, a little more than Fox, a little less than CBS.
But I'm sorry, if Netflix isn't releasing how many people are watching for how long, how are people figuring this out?
Because Nielsen has started measuring. And
so, which means Nielsen's sending out those little booklets to a handful of Netflix customers saying, write down what shows you watch?
I think it is using their web rating stuff, that marvelously accurate Nielsen net ratings that they've had for many years, that puts little bits of spyware on a bunch of people's computers to monitor what they're doing.
So just to be clear, so Nielsen's crappy, inaccurate, market controlling data is now also involved in. No, all right, fair enough. But
well, as anybody in the advertising business says, it's wrong, but it's better than nothing. And so here's another statistic from the admittedly guaranteed wrong Netflix. The average Netflix subscriber, which is lots, 56 million or something in the U.S., spends 117 minutes, meaning 2 hours a day, watching Netflix. That's more than twice the average viewer of any individual other network. Now, you could say Netflix isn't a network; it's a pile of stuff.
All right. But by the way, that I believe. I mean, in the world of Netflix and chill that the kids now operate in, I believe they watch 2 hours of Netflix.
2 hours a day, but that's a lot for, again, if you look at it wasn't so long ago, it was like 45 minutes a month or something, or a movie a month, right? So they've gone from an occasional supplement to the main way you watch stuff for lots of people.
So let's not spend too much time on this show without getting to the point of why this matters. I mean,
well, so there's a couple of angles, right? So it's big, and so there's the pushback. So one interesting tidbit that came out this week, also from RBC, was they went and talked to people in Hollywood, and guess what? Love, hate. Love the dollars, hate the power. So the Netflix and Amazon and a little bit Hulu are spending so much money that prices are going up for talent, for agents, for directors, for everything. And people like to sell to Netflix because of the bucks, because of it still has the prestige, but RBC reported people would rather do business with Amazon because they're nicer, because they don't steal all the residuals, because they give them a little more creative control, because they're not so powerful, so they don't have to be quite as jealous. And so Jeff Bezos, who is hated by everybody in the book industry and everybody in a lot of industries, is the hero of Hollywood this week.
Cutlery, shoes, whatever, yeah. So let's remember why that is, right? I mean, if you go back to the early days of Amazon, when they launched, Bezos was quite clear about the fact that he was not going to be books only. And the famous book, The Everything Store, makes it quite clear that he wants to sell everything. Mm-hmm. So he's said, without any embarrassment, the reason I like hit shows on Amazon because it helps me sell shoes. So easier for Amazon to be generous with creators financially because they make their money other ways, right? It's not the $99 a year, Prime subscription that helps them make bank. It's selling stuff.
And the interesting question, I mean ultimately TV is going to be a big enough deal for Amazon that the economics will have to make some level of sense on its own, I think, right? But Amazon has invested in the long run. They've lost money on lots of things for a long time, but they now, even though they don't want to, can sort of barely help making a profit.
What do you think of their pilot season strategy? That's a place where they and Netflix differ massively.
It's sort of a gimmick, don't you think?
They do one episode, and I've watched a couple of pilots.
I mean, it's a perfectly good experiment, right? If you're a data-driven company.
Let's go back. So you think it's a gimmick? You think that internally they know they're going to produce a show, they put one episode out there, and essentially, if people don't vote for it, they produce it anyway. Do you think that they let their artistic judgment?
No, I don't. I've got to say, I'm in a data-driven company, and somebody says, let's commission a bunch of shows, and Bezos or somebody says, all right, so how do we pick which one? And the traditional studio guy says, I decide. And he says, how do we know whether you should decide or not? So I could imagine that saying, all right, let's see if the viewers are better at this, right? It's a perfectly good experiment, and if they have higher ratings or better whatever metric that they want from letting people do this than letting Ted Sarandos pick, then that wins, right?
But just to play devil's advocate, I'm going to argue that that's a really shitty solution, because what that does is it makes Amazon a next iteration of mass media, and as opposed to what Sarandos and Hastings have said historically, which is we're in it for the long haul. We don't need something to be a hit. We don't care if it pops in the ratings, because as long as it has a finite, long, passionate audience that continues to find it over time, we can take success and stretch it out over a much longer time horizon. And Amazon is essentially doing the opposite and saying,
well, is Amazon? I haven't looked at the way the votes are counted. Are they saying we're only taking the top cumulative votes? I mean, because clearly,
do they report the votes?
I don't know, right? If I were doing this, right, I would certainly want to tell whether there is a cluster of an audience for something that I missed, but I would not necessarily approve, only comic book movies, right? I would pick the best comic book movie and the best arty documentary. I'd want something that appeals to all of my core constituencies. But so it may well be that you're really having a dozen separate elections. You just don't tell people what the district lines are.
So why are people calling Netflix a content monopoly? Where did that?
Well, there's a few. There was an interesting quote in one of these stories, saying, I think it would be bad for storytelling in general if one company was able to seize 40, 50, 60% of the share in storytelling. That's John Landgraf, who runs FX, which has something a lot smaller of the share of storytelling. But, there's a sense, is this going to be like Google or eBay or Amazon, where there's a natural monopoly and a natural leading player, or YouTube? If that turns out to be the case, if you're selling stuff, you don't want to be selling to only one customer.
All right, so I want to go back to my Amazon thing for a second, because now that I've gone and bashed them, I also want to say something positive, which is, if you go back to commercial television, the mechanism around the pilot season that operated with suits behind desks commissioning things and whatever has historically been so terrible and so fraught with garbage that almost anything, whether it's Netflix or Amazon or HBO or Hulu, has to be better than that, right? I mean,
well, they certainly have a lot of data, right? That was sort of the PR story that Netflix has been saying forever, but look, you are a fan of a lot of what Netflix does. Would it bother you if they ended up with 60% of the scripted TV market?
Look, if you look at the history of media, right? NBC has a big, must-watch TV Thursdays, and they own a big chunk of television for a while. And then, Jerry Seinfeld has the audacity to say, I don't want to do this anymore. And that scampers away. Comedy Central owns late night funny under Jon Stewart for a whole bunch of years. And then Jon Stewart says, I want to grow a beard. And he goes away. And then I don't think anybody gets there's nothing about Netflix being successful now, whether it's Stranger Things or Making of a Murderer or Narcos, that net means they own that landscape for as long as they continue to deliver content that makes 60% of the audience want to watch it.
Yep. And
which, by the way, which gets me back to my Ted Sarandos cloned rumor.
Right.
I mean,
and there are complaints. They're coming in and outbidding other people on projects. To some degree, there was one example where there was a project that they could pay more on because it was going to be R-rated, and that was going to limit how much money traditional studio distributions could make on it, but Netflix doesn't care, right? So that's...
All right, so what about this Fox suit?
Well, that's just, welcome to Hollywood and the way we do things. So Fox is suing Netflix for stealing a couple of programming executives and inducing them to break contracts. While I don't follow this, it would shock me if the 20th Century Fox or 21st Century Fox company hasn't, from time to time, hired somebody away that the person who used to employ those people might not have wanted to stick around, and might, this is, how you make friends in Hollywood is you sue them.
So you think this is just a shot across the bow? This is essentially a welcome to the club.
Welcome to the club. This is what we do here. Do you see it any different? I mean, you're more in that world than I am.
I've never seen. I mean, I've heard rumors of that clause being enforced, but I've never seen it. I mean, net. I'd love to know how many, Fox employees Netflix had to hire before they decided that they had to file suit.
Well, there's a lot of job openings. Netflix is building a huge building on Sunset Boulevard with room for 600 people in it. So
I didn't know that. Is that true?
It's what it said in Variety.
That's
or Hollywood Reporter.
All right. So Netflix is big. They're powerful. They're doing great stuff. They won a lot of Emmys, and moving on to Chapter 2, because there's more.
Although we have our new commercial, but between Chapter 1 and Chapter 2,
yes.
We are reminding you a couple things. Since you made it this far, you like the Steve and Saul Show, so you need to go onto iTunes or Google Play or wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a rating. Tell everybody how wonderful the Hacking TV is so that they can find us. And if you don't think it's as wonderful as all that, send us an email.
We love hate mail. It's our second favorite kind of mail.
Yes. hackers@hackingtv.news or @hackingtv on Twitter. We want to hear all about what you think of our show and what you want Steve to violently disagree with me about next.
Which, by the way, is becoming easier and easier as you become more set in your ways.
So we are going to disagree because one or the other of us is going to say Verizon is spending all this money on video and it makes lots of sense.
Well, that's not fair. Look. So Digiday wrote a piece in which they essentially said they're struggling to build a digital entertainment business. It was a strongly worded piece. Let's leave it at that. I mean,
it's not go 90, it's slow 90, said an anonymous person who is willing to criticize without having their name attached to it.
So I have a very particular take on this. I think that a bunch of people, not just go 90, misprojected, whatever I mean to say. Like, we're going to go to YouTube and we're going to show up with a checkbook, and some of those YouTube stars, we're going to get some of the big ones, we're just going to get to move over to our app, and the audience will just come with them. And I think they misestimated two important things. Part of why YouTube stars are YouTube stars is because they're at YouTube. And YouTube stars certainly like to make money, certainly, have economic interests, but they also, like most people that are performers, are fueled by something a little bit less transactional than money. Let's just use the word love, as attention, fans, adoration, viewers, whatever word you want to use. I think if you say to somebody that's got a fan base at YouTube, hey, how much are you making? You're making $10 a week. We'll give you 20 to move over to this app that really we're not sure we have anybody watching yet, but we're hoping you'll bring your audience with you. Mostly they say, yeah, no. So they got second run rights to the YouTube star stuff, which means the fans don't have to leave because the content didn't leave. And I just think YouTube's stake in the market is more secure than people realized.
And I've said it before, I don't get the proposition. I don't think it stands for anything. It's just a big old pile of stuff. And YouTube's a big old pile of stuff, but it has all of the stuff. And now look, they've got lots of money. They just hired a bunch of new people, right? They're integrating a bunch of stuff. So, with enough time, with talent and money, you can make stuff work if you have the stomach for it. But
no, I don't think there's any doubt that they have this, call it stomach, budget, whatever. I don't think that money is the problem. They're taking your phone bill and they're investing it in video. Good for them. I actually think the problem is that voice is really hard. Like, what people are attracted to is a voice, is a point of view, is an attitude, and I think it's very hard for Verizon to manufacture that.
I couldn't agree more. And they should double down on having a post and whatever, all the stuff that they've got.
But how would you do that? I mean, so Ariana's gone, and she was the driving voice of that property. Like, if you were interviewing,
I would go and find, there are lots of good people who have a voice, who can, look at when the New York Times needed to go hire a new editorial page editor, they hired James Bennett from The Atlantic. He was a very good person who made sense in that job. You find somebody who has the sensibility to do the content.
Yeah, I actually think you're see, I knew we'd get to you being wrong. I think you're totally wrong, and I think
you don't think there's anybody out there who could run a left-leaning investigative news organization.
I think that to hire somebody, I think the Bennett example is totally wrongheaded, because he was hired to operate a very specific editorial piece of paper, and to do it with relative unbridled freedom to have his own voice.
Right.
If you hired someone to run Huffington Post, the first question would be, can I really say what I want? Can I call Donald Trump an unbelievable fucking liar, asshole, on these pages which are owned by... And if the answer is no, okay, how do I hire people and motivate them? Because it's a big organization, right? I mean, that, Huffington Post needs how many people, if you were going in to run it as a left-leaning, let's suggest that Verizon really wants it to remain left-leaning, which I would guess they probably don't. But how do you give someone the editorial freedom inside a big corporate hierarchy to cause trouble and be feisty?
Well, you could say, look at a couple of examples, right? So General Electric, as boring a company as there is, decided that the way to make money was to make MSNBC whatever it was. There's one example. Also,
yeah, fair enough.
What happened, and this is, I think, the way they're going to justify it, is Verizon, in a joint venture with Hearst, is starting Red Something, a conservative-leaning thingy. So what they're going to be able to say is, in this partisan world, we have Red Thingy and Huffington Post, and we serve all parts with the stuff they want. Why should we water it down?
So then, why did Ariana leave? If they really were going to let somebody run it as a left-leaning...
there's a lot more to "Are you happy?" than are they going to let left-wing editorials? Yeah. I mean...
All right, so all I'm saying is Go90 needs to decide what it wants to be. I think they've decided they want it to be a mass app of lots of video for millennials, and they've spent $200 million.
Which millennial do you know who says, I need another mass app of lots of video? Nobody. So they should have built 50 little vertical. You're saying they should have built 50. Good media companies do let creative people have points of view, within all the corporate bounds, but, at its best, Harvey Weinstein got to do the Miramax thing for a decade before the, beast killed him, but, or whatever, or however you might tell that story. There were, any number of people who, can do that, but I think it's hard, and that's why, Verizon's new to this. And there's no reason to bet on them other than checkbook size.
If making good movies or television shows or video was simply a matter of how big a check you had, in any case, which brings us rather magically to the demise of the week. Do you remember the last time that the web melted down? Do you remember the regular drumbeat of a website called Fucked Company?
I lived that, right? I was covering all those obituaries on a regular basis.
So we don't have as many now. Sometimes they're quieter. Sometimes they get lost in M&A stories, and but the Mode Media story would have been front page, top of the fold, Fucked Company news if Fucked Company still existed.
Yeah, although they were, I started right. So Samira Arora, who made some money selling NetObjects, a web design platform, to IBM, and had worked at Apple a billion years ago, gets it in his head, at least 10 years ago, to start a blog network of sort of fashion and women's bloggers called Glam Media. And I wrote about it at the Times. He raised a lot of money. He was very aggressive, and he sort of promised that he was going to take this thing to the moon, and he would periodically release numbers that had lots of zeros after them, that if you dug into them, there was a lot less there than met the eye. But I, so I know him as well. His bluster and showmanship and fancy, pocket patches notwithstanding, what he was trying to do, I actually admired, which was he was taking all of these mostly women who were running blogs about
mommy blogs, and they were fashion blogs, and they were all kind of women-focused, standalone editorial entities that were having trouble. They didn't really want to sell advertising, and they really didn't have enough audience to be meaningful to an advertiser individually. But if you cumed them all together and turned them into a network, theoretically you could let them do their job, which was to make content and have fans and have followers and have women readers, and deliver back to them ads and revenue. It struck me as had it, and for a bunch of years it worked, and people got checks.
A little bit, but it assumed, right, that you could get a higher CPM, a higher advertising price, because by creating a property that looked like it had size, your personal sales representative who would go and sit down in Procter & Gamble and sell $50 CPM ads for breakfast crunchies or whatever. And in fact, the entire internet undercut that, right? So you end up with programmatic advertising, which basically means computers bidding very little for ads all over the place that aren't sold by salespeople at all. You have a lot of traffic going through social media, which means you're not really buying a brand, and a whole bunch of other things. The blogging market was not that lucrative, all things considered, but they were fighting against trend.
So two things. They changed their name a little more than 2 years ago, and they pivoted to video.
So you probably follow that more than I have. So what were they doing in video, and is it something that anybody will miss now that it's no longer there?
Well, so they did one other thing. So there's a company that no one will remember except maybe you and I and a handful of people. There was an early pre-Facebook strategy or Facebook-like strategy called Ning. And Ning was Mark Andreessen and Gina Bianchi. They put together a really nice little simple platform of being able to build communities. There was a free product and I think a paid product early on. They raised a lot of money. Ning raised $44 million and another $25 million. So they were $75 million in on a Facebook competitor product.
Well, it was a little bit more do your own group. So if you want your little league club or your whatever, you create a private label social network, and it just didn't hit critical mass.
So it got acquired by, I guess, Glam or Mode. I don't remember exactly when that happened. And
which
they were operating it
on their board.
Right, and they were operating it as well. I never followed Mode, in part because the name, like I never fully understood whether the name change. I mean, there's a funny article in the Digiday piece which says that essentially when they changed their name, Samir changed from wearing colorful clothing to black and white clothing. They changed their logo from color to black and white, and he changed his wardrobe since I guess he was a walking logo for the place.
They expanded to other verticals, right? They added men and housewares and stuff.
But here's why the story matters to our listeners. Berta Media, big German media company, got involved, put more money in. They were doing plus or minus $150 million a year in revenue. So, that's generally not the kind of a business you shut down on a Thursday afternoon. I mean, you merge it in, you sell it, you scoop it together, you downsize it, but you don't just literally shut off the lights.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so there's an open question. They got rid of Samir last year, was it, or earlier this year? But there had been rumors over the last couple of years. I mean, they wanted to take this thing public forever. And there were, somebody whispered to somebody that they were using the secret S1 provision that they have now that lets you file. And, there's all this noise or all this smoke, but nothing ever happened. They never, they never were able to come up with a convincing story for investors. So Berta presumably says, well, if we're not going to make our, big IPO flip, never mind.
I guess. All right. So last story, because we're just about out of time. The secondary chapter in the Hillary video from 9/11. I find this story deeply troubling. deeply troubling.
Okay, tell the story. Tell us what happened and tell us why it's bad for the world.
So someone's standing off to the side at the 9/11 ceremony, and Hillary leaves early and goes to her Secret Service detail in her van, and as she's getting in, her knees buckle, and then they help her in. You can define that any way you want. And this guy records it on his phone and puts it up somewhere, I guess YouTube, and it starts getting views because he's literally there was no media with her, and he recorded that incident. Along comes Storyful, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, and they say, "Hey, Mr. Czech man, why don't you let us sell that for you? And instead of giving that video away, we're going to charge media companies a license fee for it." And very quickly, they now claim it's generated some hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And if that happened to have been a Getty Images photographer and who snapped that picture and, put that out and for sale, would you object to whoever the photographer was making money selling the rights to a picture that might wind up, on the cover of Time magazine?
I think that when you're talking about so here's what bothers me about that. So first of all, I don't, going back to your experience at the Times, if you'd written an article about, Steve Jobs yelling at somebody and someone had a photograph or a video and you used it in your article, you got it from, I guess it was pre-Twitter, but somewhere, and then all of a sudden the bill collector came and said, "Now you owe us money," and you went to your editor and said, "Hey, we have to license this thing."
That's actually sort of how it worked. So if I, for most of the time I was there, right, when I was just a regular newspaper reporter, I would go and call the photo editor and say, "I need a picture of Hillary Clinton or, Jeff Bezos," and they would say, "Well, do we own a picture? Do we have a photographer who's there or we could send there? Or do we pay for it? Or have we paid for it already because we subscribed to a wire?" And there was a person, that was an economic transaction, and there was someone whose job it was to do that. Only recently, in the blogging world, where everything had to have an image, which I mostly think is really bad because you see all these totally irrelevant images on all these articles, and it makes me want to strangle the entire industry. But as we've cut back on staff, do writers have to get their own images? And I know in the traditional TV news business, you know this too, there's a whole department that is in charge of buying rights to B-roll and things. So the question is, in a world where everybody has a camera, where all the stuff is everywhere, where people are giving away stuff for free on social networks, do we not want to have that economy? Now, I'm all in favor of fair use, and if somebody says, no, we shouldn't pay for photographs anymore because it makes for better news, that doesn't bother me. But if that's not what the rule is, I don't mind somebody,
I just think that, I don't know what the pricing is for Storyful, but my assumption is that it essentially means that we're now saying that image in that video is only going to be used by mainstream media organizations that can afford it, and that individual bloggers that are to the far right or far left or edgy or kooky are going to get takedown notices and all of a sudden not be able to write relevantly about it. Anyway,
let's just say, even though we're out of time, that's not what's happening this week, right? Right now, that video is in an embeddable player from Twitter and other places, and if you want to stick it on your blog, you can. Now, is Murdoch going to try and cut that out? I mean, it may depend on the people whose rights, he's representing, but as of now, you still can put the Wobbly video on your blog.
And with that, another excellent episode has come to an end.
And now it's time for us to wobble and fall down.
But we will wobble back here again next week for another edition of Hacking TV. See you next week.
See you next week. Keep on hacking.